This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to Undistracted. I'm your host, Laura Bennett, and this is the podcast where we learn from our guests how to be better at building our lives with intention around our passions, our purpose, and deal with some of the stuff that gets in the way of that. Our guest today is journalist and author Greg Sheridan. His book, How Christians Can Succeed Today, takes us on a journey back to the world of the early church, those first small communities of believers living in a culture often hostile to their faith, drawing out lessons for today's Christians navigating life in our modern world. Looking at the wisdom of St Augustine to the resilience of the first Christians, Greg talks about how to find success in a society that views it in a very different way and how to live counterculturally in complex settings. Let's welcome Greg to the show.
Laura, it's a joy to be with you.
We've seen you write about Jesus, about God, about life, Christianity, of course before, but How Christians Can Succeed Today, it takes us into the life of Christian people. Why did you want to write about the people of Christianity now?
Well, two reasons, really, Laura. The first is that we live in a very unsympathetic environment in the West. We're not persecuted like Christians are in parts of Asia and Africa. People don't come and drag us out of our beds and kill us because we're followers of Jesus. But it's a very, very unsympathetic environment. And it's a kind of, in some respects, a neo-pagan environment. And we haven't really been in that circumstance as Christians since the first Christians 2,000 years ago. And I thought, I wonder if there's things for us to learn from the early Christians, because they were in the midst of very sophisticated Greco-Roman cultures, and they were very unpopular like we are now. They were derided and held in contempt and so on. And, of course, they converted the populations around them and changed all human history forevermore. They're the most consequential people of all. So spending a couple of years amongst them when I was researching the book was just great fun. I mean, they wrote everything down. We've got loads and loads of things that they wrote and things that people wrote about them. And so you can get right into their mindset, and they're very much, very, very familiar to us now. And then the other reason was this is my third Christian book, and I realise now, although I didn't set out to do this, there's a natural trilogy about my books. The first book was about God is good for you, was about the idea and experience of God. The second, Christians, the urgent case for Jesus in our world, was about finding Jesus, the living Jesus in the New Testament, which I treated as a historical document as a journalist. And now the third book, logically, is about the Christian people. And so the Christian people then and the Christian people today. What lessons can we take for today from their experience all those years ago?
What was the cultural context that the early Christians were living in? What was their day-to-day?
Well, when Jesus was crucified, the first Christians numbered probably somewhere between 500 and 1,000, very, very small group. They had a couple of people supporting them with a little bit of money, Mary Magdalene and Joseph of Arimathea, but not much. They didn't have powerful financial backers. They didn't have any senators. They didn't have any political base. They lived in a sophisticated culture, very literate, smart, militarily capable, technologically capable society, and Christians were regarded with contempt. They were seen as degenerate, pitiable, weird. They kept talking about eating the flesh and drinking the blood of their rabbi teacher, who had just suffered the most humiliating death that Rome could give, the death of slaves, crucifixion. And no one, least of all the first Christians, thought that they would go out and convert the world. But, of course, Jesus rose and conquered death, and the Holy Spirit came amongst them, and they were inspired and full of energy. But that didn't mean that everything became easy. You know, the old saying, faith makes things possible, it doesn't make things easy. They still had to work out all the practical difficulties of being missionary Christians. You know, how could they live their lives according to their Christian belief? How could they spread the word of the gospel, and how did they avoid getting persecuted and killed by the Roman authorities? They were episodically persecuted. They weren't constantly persecuted. But the Christian Program for Life was so spectacularly good, so superior to everything else around it. For example, they didn't kill their girl babies, so their families had a lot more girls, so they were much happier families, and the pagan society around could notice that. Marriage amongst Christians was a sacrament of mutual love and commitment, very different from what it was in Roman life, and people could see that Christian marriages were much happier, and so on. You know, they stayed in the plagues and they helped people, and so they didn't die in such large numbers, and they won a reputation for being kind and helpful to people. And all of this over time had a tremendous effect on how the society saw them and the people who were attracted to their lives and to their message. So they modelled Jesus and they had the message of Jesus.
When you got into their headspace for the research of this book, was there anything that helped you understand what it was like to be part of the first generation of this movement? Because for modern Christians, you know, the idea of evangelism or people speaking about faith, people living according to a practice of life modeled on the teachings of Jesus, there's a level of normalcy to that. We're familiar with the concept. But for this first generation of Christians, they were the ones kind of setting the tone on what that looked like. Was that ever something that your research told you more about?
It is. So the research was great fun. But I tell you, the single overriding feeling I had after, and I was reading things in translation. I'm not a scholar of biblical languages, but the overwhelming feeling I had after reading loads and loads and loads by and about the first Christians was not one of strangeness, nor even one of admiration, though I massively admired them, but one of familiarity. They had all of, the way they addressed life still was essentially practical. Where were we going to live? How are we going to pay for the things we need to do? So the first community of Christians you see in the Acts of the Apostles have no private property. Everything is held in common and so on. But then they realise that that's not really practical. It doesn't really work. And they're going to look after people who are sick and can't work and so on. But if you're part of the community and you don't want to work, that's no good. There've got to be rules. You've got to work if you want to eat and so forth. And what strikes me is the sort of sheer practicality of it all. They've got to raise funds for the church in Jerusalem, which has fallen on hard times. They've got to look after widows and orphans. So widows and orphans were the poorest and most vulnerable people in the ancient world, and Christians felt they needed to look after Christian widows and orphans, and then, of course, they were extending charity to everyone else. Now, there was a magnificent quality of inspiration that they had in their Christian belief. So when I say familiarity, I'm not saying that least of all me, but generally we live up to the first Christians, and they didn't all live up to it either. I mean, when they were persecuted, some of them gave in and reviled Christ and so on, and then they were sorry later and wanted to come back. So that was a bit of a controversy amongst the early Christians. Do we have the folks back who denied Jesus in order to avoid persecution? And if we do have them back, do we make them wait for a little while? But one of the things I found inspiring about them was that in the sheer practicalities and regular challenges of life, it was like talking to your brothers and sisters, It wasn't like talking to some strange species from outer space or something like that. They certainly were passionately alive with the message of Jesus, the hope of eternal life and so on. But also the sense that this Christian life, that was the right life, that was the way to live.
These are people that lived, 2,000 years ago or so. What is it about their experience that makes them so relatable?
Well, I go up to about the year 400. I finished with St Augustine in Hippo in North Africa. And Augustine is a wonderful figure. He wrote the first great psychological autobiography, his Confessions. And people often say he's the last man of antiquity or the first man of the Middle Ages. I call him the first modern, really. And one of the great things about him is, so he's a bishop or a pastor leading a big community of Christians in Hippo in North Africa. So he's busy all day, forming marriages, sorting out the holiday disputes of his staff, adjudicating on disputes, whatever have you, leading prayers. And then at night, he's writing out magnificent works of theology, trying to think through the Christian revelation at its deepest level. So no one should ever think the first Christians were just simple folk and they believed whatever they were told and they were superstitious and so on. Quite the reverse. They were the most sceptical, rational people in the ancient world. But the reason I'm focusing on Augustine in answer to your question is a number of Christian villages near Hippo were typically raided by bandits and brigands, and he wanted them protected by Roman soldiers. Now, there had long been soldiers as part of the Christian movement. Christians hadn't really been pacifists, but he was asking soldiers to commit violence in defence of Christian communities, not to go out and start violence, but to meet murderous brigands with, defensive violence to protect the Christian villages that he was responsible for. Now, that led him to work out the just war theory, because he was saying, well, I'm asking these soldiers, if necessary, to kill people. How does that square with the gospel? And it's magnificent to watch his mind trying to come to grips with this. How do I apply Christian principles? I can't accept the view that Christian villages should just be slaughtered by marauding criminals at will. But what does self-defense really mean? Now, we have lived with the just war theory ever since. That still governs how men and women of conscience come to matters of defence and military matters and so forth. There are books being written every day on the just war theory. So that's just one example of a million where the early Christians, in working out their beliefs, gave something to human civilization. This is how you deal with this problem in an ethical way under the guidance of God.
If we're going to be inspired by them then, perhaps in that regard, and maybe looking at some of the other ways, that they found practical solution and ideas for looking after people and the like, what would it look like now for Christians in this neo-pagan culture, as you called it, to, I suppose, take from their example to assist in the needs of society in this moment?
Well, one of the great things about the early Christians was that they were very practical, but they never compromised on the transcendent supernatural truths and indeed weirdness of their beliefs. There's a wonderful episode in Acts of the Apostles where Paul is in the custody of the Roman governor Festus, who says to him, for goodness sake, Paul, just stop this preaching about Christ rising from the dead in his body and I'll let you go. And Paul answers, no, I must proclaim Christ first risen from the dead, and we will all rise from the dead. And Festus says, you must be mad, Paul. You've been driven insane by reading too many books. And the great thing is, Paul there was offered his freedom if he would just tone it down a bit. And they never toned it down a bit. So one little practical answer is, I think Christians today are called upon to own their faith. Not necessarily, not everyone is a preacher, not everyone is a mass media communicator or whatever, but Christians shouldn't be ashamed of their faith. They should own their faith publicly, because fellow Christians need the solidarity, and non-Christians may never have heard the truth before until that Christian speaks to them and proclaims the faith. And we mustn't be deterred by the fact that we're not perfect. We don't live up to the Christian ideal. A wonderful Anglican bishop said to me recently, the accusation is that the church is full of hypocrites. That's not true. There's always room for plenty more. We're all hypocrites in the sense that we never quite reach our ideal. But so I think Christian leaders today shouldn't compromise on the weirdness of their message. They should lead exemplary lives which show people what it means to be a Christian. Got to care for the poor. There's no doubt about that. That's all through the Gospels. It's all through the early Christian practice. caring for the marginalised and the poor is very important. And one element of today's society, which is actually quite encouraging, is there are three sort of groups related to Christianity in today's society. There are post-Christians, so that's typically baby boomers, people in my age group, who maybe had a little bit of Christianity as kids, or their parents went to church, or their grandparents or something, and they've effectively been inoculated against Christianity. They think Christianity is dull and boring and backward-looking and repressive and sexist and patriarchal and racist and everything else. And they're really hostile to Christianity if they think about it at all. Then a second group is Christians. We're still a very big minority in Australia and in most Western societies. But then there's this third group, and here's the comparison to the early days of the first Christians. Anyone under about 45 today, unless they've gone to a religious school or something, they've really never met Christianity. You know, when I was a kid, look at popular culture. When I was a kid, all the Christmas movies were things like Miracle on 34th Street or It's a Wonderful Life, very overtly religious movies. Christmas movies now for 25 years have been Love Actually or Home Alone or something. You know, God, Jesus, they don't get a look in on the Christmas celebration. So popular culture is against Christianity. Modern person under 45 would never have met the writings of Paul unless they've been attending a Christian church. Yet Paul was probably the most significant writer in human history. So our education system is so bad now that we don't tell our kids about the most important writer in all human history, because we as a culture have become anti-Christian. But these younger people, especially say under 40 or even under 30, they are, in a sense, without any judgment on them, they are new pagans. Now, that I don't mean that in any pejorative sense at all, but they have the strengths and the weaknesses of pagans. The weaknesses of pagans, they don't want the party to stop. You know, they can see no reason to limit pleasure and so on. But the strength is that they haven't been taught. They haven't learnt that Christianity is boring and wicked, and they suffer a crisis of unbelief. And also they have the idealism and the courage of youth, and they're looking for a place to spend, some way to spend that idealism and courage that is meaningful. So they're looking for meaning. Now these are absolute wonderful potential recruits for Christianity, and we are now seeing that in the West. Just in the last couple of years, the statistical decline in Christianity in the West has stopped, largely because the Gen Zers are much more religious than anyone ever expected them to be. And so, in a sense, being pagans rather than post-Christians actually makes them prime recruits for Christians, so long as we're going out and trying to tell them about the good news.
If we're going to call them, you know, potential recruits, or that's kind of the idea of it, bringing them into the fold of this Christian life, what does that mean? What kind of life would they then live on the other side of that? Because I know for some people, the idea of signing someone up for something, bringing them into something, it's what are you asking me to be part of? What kind of life are you saying I would be living? What would it look like for perhaps a fresh generation to come into this idea of Christian living?
Well, that's a fantastic question. Very, very profound question, probably in a sense above my pay grade, but I'd offer you a couple of thoughts. One is that belonging to a Christian community has to be both an act of will of the person who is belonging, an act of welcome of the community that's bringing them in, and it has to have an experiential quality. You have to experience God. Knowing God is more important than knowing about God. But also, the Christian life is the good life. You're living with purpose. You're living in relationship with God. You're living in community with fellow Christians. You're pointing in the right direction, even if you're not living up to the right level. You're pointing in the right direction. I know myself. I couldn't be myself if I didn't have the promise of God's forgiveness. You know, you look back on your life and you think of all the times you've been mean to people or done the wrong thing, and it just seems horrible. And the thing that makes it redeemable is the sense that that you have God's forgiveness. And in every way, the Christian life is sustaining and uplifting and consoling, and it has a purpose. You don't join it in a sense to get the benefits, although you do get benefits from it. You know, there's overwhelming sociological evidence that people who have religious belief and attend church or its equivalent once a week are the happiest people in the world. But you don't really join it looking for benefits. That's the wrong spirit. You join it looking for purpose and meaning, and the purpose and meaning do give you great benefit.
And that crisis of meaning that you spoke about a moment ago, you know, I think anybody within our culture, anybody looking on at what's happening in any kind of reflective way, sees loneliness, sees these senses of despair, and definitely the distraction that really weighs on people. What kind of answer does Christianity provide to those challenges?
Well, everybody's challenge is different, of course. You know, God creates a perfectly shaped cross for every human being, and each of us bears our own cross differently. But much of the crisis of meaning today comes from afflicts people who lack a sense of purpose. And I don't mean that in a critical way of them. I just mean that as a sort of an analysis of people's condition. Now, if you're busy yourself helping the poor, you're less likely to worry about yourself. You know, in the second half of this book, I profile contemporary Christians who I think are living out the values and life of the early Christians. One of the people I profile is a young woman named Rosie Drum, who, as a young woman at university, as part of her Christian mission, would visit AIDS sufferers who are beautiful young men, dying often alone. This is 20 or 30 years ago. And really, it's the outward focus rather than the inward focus. I mean, you do have an inward focus through prayer and the interior life, but very often it's the outward focus that is very redemptive for people. But on the other hand, if you are just broken and wrecked for whatever reason, any Christian community will offer you a hand up. A friend, I remember for a previous book profiling a Salvation Army leader, and she said one of the most affecting things she ever heard was from a Salvation Army client who said, I need people in my life who aren't paid to be here. You know, she was a person who didn't have that much social support, but the Salvation Army were her friends, and they invited her around for dinner, and they provided solidarity for her, not so much financial or whatever, but just human warmth and friendship. And you know, the Christian door is always open. Really, I've never come across a Christian church where the door is shut and they say, you know, no visitors welcome. You know, please fill out a 10-page application form first.
Yeah, there's a certain kind of warmth and, as you say, a welcome that is really distinct and it's really important, and that would be considered countercultural in some respects as well. And increasingly, you know, the need to be countercultural, I suppose, is there for Christians because, as you've said, as we've talked about, there is something really different about the way Christians want to live and the acceptability of that to some of what's more mainstream now. But how would a Christian live in a countercultural way without falling into bitterness or entering into the culture wars or becoming part of the really provocative, really divisive kind of tone that sits in some of mainstream society right now?
So that's also a very good question. I must say in this discussion we're having, the questions are much cleverer than the answers, really. But I think that, again, the example of the early Christians is very interesting. They were profoundly countercultural. So it was common in the Greco-Roman world that masters could do whatever they liked to their slaves, whereas Christian morality imposed a limit on what masters could do and protected the integrity of the slaves' bodies. It was common in the ancient world that fathers owned their children and could leave them out to die if they wanted to. You know, as I said, girl babies were often rejected by families. Very few Roman families had more than one daughter. And Christian families couldn't do that. And so there was, just by being Christians, it was a standing rebuke to the practices of Roman society. You know, it was common for Roman young men to sow their wild oats, and this was regarded as a really good thing. Christians were preaching restraint and self-control on young men, and this was regarded as killjoy and spoil sports, and the Christians were uppity and so forth. But they led a much happier life. Now, what does that mean in modern society? Well, first of all, maybe you want to get involved in the culture wars, but if you do, we Christians have an obligation to be happy warriors, to not let battle distort our own souls, and also to be kindly to people we regard as our adversaries in argument. But if you're part of the normal human, majority who doesn't like political conflict and so forth, I think being in a Christian community involves both withdrawal and engagement. Just going to church for an hour every week means you're withdrawing from the secular society and you're creating a community for that hour. But normally a church life goes for much more than an hour. So, you might have a cup of tea after the church service, and then you've got some works in your parish for the poor and some works for children. And the parish tries to have a social and a spiritual life. There might be a Bible study group and so forth. Now, the fact that these values aren't reflected every day in the surrounding culture shouldn't really upset Christians. That's okay too. However, Christians themselves are now creating a lot of popular culture. So one of the people I interview or profile in the second half of the book is Dallas Jenkins, who created the TV series The Chosen. Well, this is a binge-worthy, terrific 5-series TV production on the life of Jesus and the Gospels. It's very good TV. It's very, very watchable. And Dallas Jenkins couldn't get Hollywood to fund it, not because of religious bigotry, but just because they thought it couldn't possibly make a return. So he crowdfunded the first season, raised $11 million. Not a huge amount to produce a TV series with, but enough to allow him to make a professional job. And it's now been seen by over 500 million people. 500 million different people have seen at least one episode of The Chosen. I profile Marilyn Robinson, a wonderful Christian novelist. She wrote such a beautiful Christian novel, Gilead, that it won the Pulitzer Prize. And so if you're thinking, what do I do in the culture? There's nothing Christian. Well, there is. There's the TV series The Chosen. There's the novel Gilead. I profile Bishop Robert Barron of the Word on Fire mission. They produce thousands of different elements of social media. He does a sermon or a homily once a week that goes for 14 or 15 minutes. Very easy to listen to as a podcast on your daily walk. It's neither dumbed down nor unapproachable. So all of these green shoots everywhere. And it's funny, his story is particularly interesting because as a young man, he thought, so he's a Catholic, and my books are very non-denominational with all the major denominations represented. But he went to his bishop and he said, look, we're not doing anything on social media. What are you going to do about it? The bishop said, no, you've asked the wrong question. It's what are you going to do about it? And so Robert Barrett, as a young priest, raised money to get a radio spot on Chicago radio once a week. And out of that grew the Word on Fire mission, which has now had hundreds of millions of social media downloads, sold millions of books and so forth. So Christians are creating a popular culture, and everyone in culture now lives in a minority. We don't really have a supervening overall culture. People listen to your radio station. I mean, that's part of their cultural life. So it's all there. Christians can't really say we don't have access. Imagine how much harder it was for the early Christians, though, because they had the Jewish scriptures, and then very early they realised how important the Christian scriptures were, both what became the canonical scriptures and also the other letters and instructions and so on, which they wrote to each other. Some of them who were martyred wrote accounts of the days leading up to martyrdom and so on. They copied these out before print and circulated them all over the Christian world. And so they kind of created their own their own culture, not only in their family homes, but in their own written material.
They'd be just startled to see the influence of AI, I'm sure, in some of the way that we, try to create things and do things and disseminate stuff. They definitely did it in a much more hands-on kind of way. And it's great that we can connect to their experience through your writing and also, modern Christians that are doing great things. The title, How Christians Can Succeed Today. Let me ask you then what it would look like. From your perspective, what would it look like for Christians to succeed? What's a picture of that now?
Well, ultimately, I think it means helping more people to understand the truth of Jesus and to live their lives that way. Now, we moved from a society which was Christendom in the sense that the main explanation of life was a Christian explanation. Now, that was often a hypocritical society. It didn't live up to its ideals in many, many ways. We've moved now to an apostolic age where the main explanations given for life and so forth are not Christian, and indeed they're often hostile to Christianity. But we live really in a bleeding culture, in a bleeding and distressed culture. You can see the deaths of despair. I think the chief cause of death for Australians aged 15 to 44 is suicide. You see epidemics of family violence, domestic violence. You see terrible, terrible drug abuse. And these are sins and crimes and practices of despair. And why would people despair in such an affluent society as ours, one of the most affluent societies ever to exist in the whole history of humanity? It's because they've got their key relationships wrong, especially their relationship with God. And if Christians succeed, it's bringing balm and hope and reassurance and comfort and purpose and joy to more and more people. And what you would get then is a society which is compassionate and friendly and full of human solidarity. Now, our society is not the most evil society in the history of the world, don't get me wrong. It's got so many of those qualities, largely because of its Christian inheritance. But you would see broken lives repaired. That would be a sign of Christian success, I think.
I think your answers have met the questions wonderfully, Greg. Thank you so much for your time today.
Look, it's really been a great pleasure to talk to you, and thanks so much for taking interest in the book.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Undistracted. Rate it, review it, share it with a friend. Let me know what you think. Email undistracted@hope1032.com.au. And until next time, enjoy living this undistracted life.